I haven't started reading yet, but I'm going to in a few minutes. And I figured that if I went live a little earlier, I could adjust the camera and the audio for anybody who needed it adjusted if they popped in. So I'm looking at my phone because I have to check on a different issue related to the books right now, and then I'll be more engaged with anybody who pops in. I figured this also gives people a chance they don't feel like they're missing things right away. So, okay. So I'm not sure about this angle. That's part of the problem. I feel like I gotta sit a little closer. As you can see, I'm not at the other location I used before. My hair's a mess. But I'm back in my apartment at our employer because I had to make a trip back here to pick up some things anyway. So we are on chapter 3, and I'm just going to check to give you an estimation of maybe how long that will be. I believe this is not as lengthy a chapter. Yeah, so this will be shorter than the last section, but it'll get us kicked off for the week. So, while we're waiting, for those who are coming in late, it's hot here in Maine today, and I just got back from being at the gym, so I'm a little parched slash tired. So we'll see how this goes. But I'm not doing a lot of writing right now because I'm primarily working on a project with my mother at the school she teaches at, where I'm helping some middle school students make castles based on like authentically medieval designs, which is really cool. But it bites into chances to read my own work and then revise it, which I'm sort of at a stage with right now where I'm revising some of the stuff that I'd written earlier. Just noticed I have a spot. Oh, there's a button there. Didn't know that. So I haven't had as much time to crank out more pages, although at this point I'm pretty sure I want to say like at least half. That's probably not right. 40% of the third book I know what needs to get done and exactly where it's going to go and what to write and all that stuff. So the third book should be moving along pretty quickly. I am going to say, for those who know, the first book took me quite a long time. And now I got to fix the title of this channel because it says I'm playing Bloodborne, which I'm not. But the I can't edit this. Well, that's irritating. The situation is such that I don't see myself getting the third one done in a year, which is about, give or take, how long it took to do. There we go. It's about how long it took me to do the second book. It only took a year because the second book was just a lot easier. I originally thought the first book and the second book were all going to be one book, and it would have been 1,000 pages, which is way too much. So I cut them into two. But it meant that when I finished the first one, it was like starting the second one was not a problem at all. The third one now requires a lot more work in the sort of drafting and rewriting stages. Like I didn't have to do a ton of rewriting of the second book because I had written the first one and rewritten the first one multiple times and revised it so many times. So I guess what I'm trying to say is for people who might be interested in when is the third one going to come out, it could be a couple years. I don't know that. I mean, I have no idea. I could finish it this summer and I could get it into what I consider a publishable state over the winter and start looking at a publication date that's in the spring, which would put it less than a year from now. But I don't want to guarantee that right now. I'm just looking at it and thinking most of what my process at this point has been is just I'm going to write and keep going because I know what I need to hit for in terms of plot points and events and um, all that good stuff. Character development, uh, plot development, all of those things. I know where that's going, but I don't actually know um, how long it's going to take to sort of get all the threads down and then fill in all of the stuff between those major threads. So I'm writing right now, and as I'm writing, I'm basically looking at stuff going, I think that could be better, or there needs to be something phrased better, or the wording here seems redundant, or whatever. But the actuality is that when you're writing a book, if you just need to get the thing done so you can then go back and fix it later, that's what you do. I'm at that stage. That means I have no idea how long it's going to take to fix it. So for those who were really hoping for the third book sooner, I don't want to be a downer, but that's sort of the state that it's in. It's probably not going to come out. It's probably not going to come out as soon as the second one did, or as quickly as the second one did, comparative to the first one, or comparative to the second one. It won't come out as fast as that. So I'm going to start with chapter 3 now. Thanks for dealing with that intro. If anybody's around for Q&A after, I will take Q&A. And as I have mentioned a few times, if you want to send questions in via Twitter or Facebook or email, if you've got the newsletter, if you're part of the newsletter, or you want to send them through Twitch, please go ahead and I'll try to answer those on the stream at some point. I'm still going to be streaming Baldur's Gate Siege of Dragonspear tomorrow and Thursday, and there's probably going to be some impromptu Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3 during the week because I'm starting to play those more, even though I find Bloodborne incredibly stressful to play. So that's where we're at. Okay, so chapter 3, recap. At this point, Trem and Joven have decided, Trem has decided he's going with Joven. Joven has informed him that he is looking for his father, and nothing is going to stop him from looking for his father. Trem, we know, does not have or know his birth parents and abandoned or chose to leave his foster parents some time ago. Feels a connection because he, too, is looking for parental figures in his life. So, Trem, feeling some level of connection to Joven beyond the fact they're both half-elven, decides, well, I can't let this kid go off on his own. And he thinks of him as a kid because, as we've established through a few of the clues in the first couple chapters, Trem is much older than he appears. He's been frozen in time, and though he doesn't look like he's gotten older, he's actually been around for much longer than his appearance suggests. So at the end of the last chapter, Trem, having encountered a soul tree, which is a Forester tradition of burying their most venerated members and having a tree grow in their place, Trem encountered one of a very famous figure in mortal history, a man named Garand Oakart, who was a druid. That tree informed him essentially that to simply sit by and watch the world pass by is not living, and that continuing to prolong his potentially unending life is not living either, but living is actually going out and doing things. So, shouldn't Trem go do something? And Trem then tried to contact Garand Oakart, was intercepted by Curvin, the god of time, who is the same god who is responsible for Trem's agelessness, and has essentially decided that, well, I sort of want to follow Joven anyway, and they seem to be egging me into it, and though Trem has a very combative personality, he's basically decided he's going to help Joven. So they've started their trip. Their plan is to go to this town called Gailakill. Gailakill is essentially a hub town. It's in the middle of Teth Tanir continent of Lagotia. It's in a place called the Dust Plains, very hilly, rocky, windswept area. And it acts as a place where people go when they're looking for other people, rumors, trade, etc. So, chapter 3 starts with them still on the road. Joveneleth awoke as the sun began its early climb into the sky. He stretched and looked out towards the road through the morning haze. He found it hard to tell if his lack of visual clarity was from lingering mist or his own foggy mind. Joven reasoned that it was only a little past dawn, but he had slept easily and comfortably on the forest floor. Trem was nowhere in sight, but any doubts from the night were assuaged by the bedroll that was neatly folded and attached to his pack leaning against a tree. A small fire was boiling some water, and a slim leather pouch was lying close to it along with a wooden cup. Joven carefully removed the copper pan and poured some water into his cup, adding a touch of the leather pouch's contents. He smelled what he presumed was one of Trem's teas, a strange mixture. It was certainly some sort of draught he'd never experienced. Taking the cup with him, he walked to the fringe of the woods and saw Trim at the edge of the road sipping from his own simple wooden receptacle. He nodded as Jovaneleth approached. Walking to stand beside him, Jovan looked north with Trem. It doesn't look like anyone passed us in the night. Trem did not answer but continued to watch the road before them. Trying to engage his companion, Jovan asked, "What's in this tea, anyways? It smells odd." Trem actually smiled a little. "Why don't you try it?" Jovan obliged, taking a small sip. It was sweet and smooth, almost like honey. Then suddenly it turned shockingly, deeply spiced and bitter, and he gasped aloud. Unable to contain himself, he spat it onto the road. "Pfwa! Ugh! What is this?" Trem was laughing openly now, patting his gagging companion on the back. He said, "The elves call it sugar-burn tea, made from the plant of the same name. It takes time to develop a taste for it." Still laughing softly to himself, Trem walked back to the campsite, shaking his head in mirth. Despite the terrible taste in his mouth, by the time Jovan had emptied his cup onto the road, he was chuckling himself. The two gathered their things and resumed the march north in congenial silence. The weather was cool but not unpleasant, and before an hour has passed, they had begun an amicable conversation about their destination. Jovaneleth had been to the town a few times before and described it to his companion, who only vaguely remembered it. Near the end of the Age of Emergence, men and elves had dragged great collections of lumber from the Silverleaf Forest to the center of the Dust Plains, atop a large rise in the stony earth. There they had founded the wooden-walled town of Gailakill, which had been a hub of travel, rumor, and information since its very inception. The thick, high wooden walls were ruled over by even more massive, round wooden towers formed from the largest logs that had been brought to the site, allowing a clear view for some distance around the township proper. The interior of the wall held several temples, taverns, shops, houses, and the famous Inn of the Four Winds at the center, where the two main roads crossing the Dust Plains met. This intersection represented the importance of Gailakill, a settlement that had been founded by so many together that none were actually certain who had ruled it when it was formed, or where the name had come from. When the road to Southron became harder and more dangerous to travel due to increased numbers of gnolls, followed by the glut of new bandits marauding the roads from the fallout of the War of the Lion, Gailakill became the stopping place for those on their way across the continent. Its high walls offered safety to those within, and the militia was always well stocked with volunteers and occasional visitors willing to lend a hand in the town's defense. The population had numbered just shy of 7,000 within the walls, and around 1,000 outside, but recent events had driven many to Gailakill in search of refuge. The number of would-be residents had ballooned to over 11,000, many sleeping on the streets inside the palisade, or, if trapped outside, against the wooden barrier itself, as though proximity would afford them greater protection. Where the city had once been a cultural crossroads, it had become a beacon of hope for those with very little left. The burden on the residents was understandably difficult to bear. Gailakill had begun as a small town, blossomed into almost a true urban center like nearby Osmandius, and throughout it all had adjusted to the necessary expansions. The inn had grown into a 3-story building with 2 floors for sleeping quarters and a large common room for traveling performers and mealtimes. The trades to be found in the city expanded from the fundamentals of smiths, carpenters, and masons to more exotic occupations like alchemists, jewelers, and even a mage, with her own shop of arcane paraphernalia. The town had prospered, and everyone gained more revenue from the increase in visitors. Thus it was a place that had weathered danger before, particularly the Gnoll campaigns rebuffed by the Orcs and Anglo-Daeks many years ago. However, the city had always remained a beacon of independence and self-sufficiency. Never had the people been asked to take on the role of saviors and supporters of the larger region, and the strain of accommodating the sudden influx of refugees was very real. The gates were solid and well maintained. The volunteer militia of the town, usually composed only of those who lived within the walls, took turns at the entrances. Of late, they patrolled in groups of 4 as a precaution. The threat of assault from the Broken was real and growing more serious by the day. Jovaneleth had explained to Trem the growing sense of impunity among raiders. Broken clans had stepped up assaults on the eastern towns, and there were words of terrible pillagings and razings of entire villages, all without response from any of the region's powers. Gailakill had determined to remain exempt from all conflict for now. The town was never meant to be the fulcrum of a nation, and wished to remain uninvolved in the violence of the Dust Plains. Any refugees from eastern towns were openly welcomed and housed, if they could afford it, but that was the extent of Gailakill's involvement. As long as they did not blatantly defy the Broken incursions, they hoped to at least delay the necessity of dealing with them. That delay, Jovan had advised, would kill the town in the end. No matter how high they built the walls or how many guards patrolled them, the Broken still possessed a weapon unlike anything Gailakill had seen, their Gnoll allies. A Gnoll was something like a cross between a wolf and an unnaturally long-limbed man. With large, heavy arms and thick chests, they often were forced to lean on one hand rather than stand, and usually did so except in battle. Their rear legs were thinner like those of a wolf, but in time some strengthened them to the point where a fully grown gnoll could walk and fight on their hind legs for hours at a time. Standing on two legs, a gnoll would easily reach 7 or 8 feet in height, dwarfing almost any opponent. Erect or in a crouch, they wielded massive halberds, broadswords, and battle axes with one hand, weapons a strong man might find difficult to lift with two. Further enhancing their battle prowess, their skin was as tough and as hardened leather, and difficult to pierce with anything save a close-range crossbow bolt or a very strong sword arm. Trem had killed his share of gnolls, though he made no mention of this to Jovaneleth, but he had always taken care to fight them in small groups. Jovaneleth had implied that hundreds of gnolls might be serving with the Broken now, and Trem shuddered at the thought. Gnolls had long been a problem on the Dust Plains. The numbers ebbed and flowed with time, but they had required the combined efforts of several groups to be culled in the past. Gnoll society is nomadic, an establishment of pack dominance integral to the whole race's survival. Gnolls follow the most powerful among their number, and assault targets ripe in potential supplies. In packs, gnolls communicate like wolves or dogs with barks, howls, and snarls, but many are intelligent enough to learn the common tongue and speak it haltingly with other mortal races. Rarely is this skill applied, however, as gnolls are a veritable force of death and destruction, communication not being very high on their list of valued skills. Rumors said that the gnolls following the Broken because they ate the flesh of slain enemies, and where the Broken raided, there was always plenty of food. The value of a contingent of gnolls in an army could not be underestimated. Their raw power and speed made them as punishing as charging cavalry, and their strength and size gave them the ability to tear down even well-designed defensive structures. It was difficult to tell exactly how true the word of the gnoll involvement with the Broken was. As Jovan implied, there was such fear of them that most wanted to bury their heads in the earth and pretend the devastation in the east was not really happening. Such was the case in Gylekill, and the city did not have the capacity to withstand a gnoll assault if it came. Perhaps they would have been able to secure aid from an outside force like Osmandius or the Eagle Knights, but they appeared unwilling or unable to acknowledge their own precarious position. Gylekill had chosen to ignore what was happening around it, too drunk with its own recent prosperity to see the trap being plainly laid out to snare it. As they walked, Trem shook his head at the foolishness of it all. Jovaneleth clearly in agreement and lamenting the short-sighted leaders of the hub city. Reaching the edge of Silverleaf, at last, they paused, looking at the vast expanse of land that stretched out before them. Rolling hills of bare grass and thin shrubs spread for miles all around, and Trem could see plainly dirt and dust swirling for a great way off in the distance. The few trees across land sticking out of the rocky earth like giant splinters. Jovaneleth stood at his side, their conversation forgotten as they took in the scene. After a moment, Trem adjusted his pack and weapons. We may as well keep moving. The town won't get any closer with us just staring at the road. Right, Jovaneleth replied as he moved to follow. I hope we can find news of my father. It was so long ago that he should have passed through Gylekill, if he ever did. I wonder if anyone will remember him, if they did meet. If memory serves, Trem said thoughtfully, the Inn of the Four Winds is a place for storytellers and travelers, and your father was a well-known man even if disguised. Someone will remember a guest asking questions about the invaders and the situation in the north. That is one region where few travelers come from, as the Napoleons have always kept to themselves. No one would be actively asking about those invaders unless he was looking for trouble, and an innkeeper always marks the guests that could cause trouble. You don't think the innkeeper would throw my father out? If he did, Trem answered, then we will be sure to repay him in kind. Jovan did not respond, noting the dangerous light in Trem's eye. As he moved down the road, he glanced at Trem's side beneath the cloak. He saw the shimmer of the old sword hilt beneath it, and not for the first time wondered where he had acquired such a unique-looking and finely made weapon. Shaking the thought from his head, Jovaneleth concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other as Trem's piercing eyes scanned the horizon in search of any danger that might be looming about them. His wound throbbed, and he felt fatigued, but the energy of acting at last spurred him on towards their destination. One section down. In his dungeon laboratory, Deirvaron strode about hurriedly, searching for his vast array of materials and spell components, divided seemingly without intent among a great number of tables and shelves. He wanted to complete his test to perfect his latest incantation before being summoned again. That meant he had to hurry, much more than he normally would have, and hurry meant error, which would infuriate him. Deirvaron hated to be rushed. Time should not be a factor by which he was governed any more. Death was no longer a looming fear for the wizard. After all, he had experienced dying once already, and did not intend to go through the process again. Many years ago, in a time he had only broken recollection of, he had been a sorcerer of no small fame and talent. In fact, some might have called him the greatest mage of his time, perhaps even of all times, but with that greatness had come knowledge. It was the knowledge that he would never have all the magic that magic could grant him, because eventually he would die. There was simply not enough time to unravel all the secrets of his art, so he sought a way to avoid that annoying little thing called mortality. Deavron found his loophole in the power of Naroth, the god of death. At that time, contact with avatars and other varying degrees of immortal manifestations on Teth Tanir was not as rare as they had since become. Naroth, with his unmatched understanding of mortality, knew how Deavron could obtain the power to undo his own demise. Such an incredible feat came with a price, of course, incurred both in the moment of agreement to Naroth's terms and for all time afterwards. First, Deavron had to pledge himself to serve Naroth's larger goals, lest the god turn his full attention and ire on him, and recall his soul to the realm of the dead where it belonged. This unveiled the second portion of the bargain Deavron had to make. He was not being allowed to continue living indefinitely, but granted a return to his corpse once he had expired. In the end, he had to welcome death to overcome it. Even this did not come easily. Despite the immense complexity of the rite, Deavron was not rendered invincible and could still be killed, which he discovered when he rose up out of his coffin and was attacked by the horrified priests laying him to rest. Determined to be free and pursue mastery of the arcane once again, he defeated them with his magic, but not before one managed to pick up an old sword from one of the tombs in the crypt and slice his right arm off at the elbow. Deavron never noticed until he tried to use his arm after fleeing the crypt, for he had felt no pain and saw no blood. He had escaped from his tomb and returned to the mortal world, but Deavron was furious. His magic required the dexterity of both limbs, and now he was without one. Once again Naroth aided him, this time with no catch involved, for he was useless to the god of death without his arm. In place of his mortal limb, Deavron found a strange appendage formed from the souls of the dead. The hand and arm were black, barely holding the form of their former living tissue, and looking more like smoke than anything flesh. But it could manipulate magical components, wield utensils, and draw runes as adeptly as the human hand it had once been. Deavron designed a gauntlet made of black steel, a rare metal forged in volcanic fire with obsidian magic to cover his arm up to the elbow. The foul hand's touch ripped apart the spirit of those who felt it even for a moment, and despite the terror this could inspire, it was often an inconvenience. Deavron believed that his fearsome appendage utterly erased his victims from existence, though he had not taken the time to study its effects formally. For centuries, Deavron had been permitted to do as he wished in the art of magic. Hiding far to the north in an old abandoned house just outside the town of Tianus, he perfected old spells and invented new. His ultimate goal was to master the 6 schools of arcane magic completely, an accomplishment no wizard of any race or nation had ever managed, not even the infamous god sorcerer. Soon he realized that in order to do this, he would need to gather magical tomes and scrolls at a rate faster than he alone was capable of. Worse still, his isolation in the barren frozen reach made it difficult to obtain supplies for his experiments, further slowing his progress. In frustration, he toiled alone and in secret, though he did not long for company. Naroth's demands that he keep his existence hidden forced Deavron to use complex and often delayed means of acquiring components for his work. His time near Tianus highlighted the rift between Naroth and his servant, for Deavron cared not at all for the god of death's vision for the mortal world, but was insatiable in his quest for magical supremacy. Their allegiance was one of convenience. Naroth had given Deavron time and means to complete his work, and Deavron offered the god of death a powerful presence on Teth Tanir to oversee his goal of dominion there. Unfortunately, it now seemed Deavron's dream was never to be realized, for his benefactor still held him to his end of the bargain, and the wizard's duties to Naroth increased almost daily. It was only 4 years ago that he was told to leave his work and go assist another in service to Naroth, a barbarian from the west commanding a great army. Deavron had met Wolfbane and his allies in the staging area the Westerner had established in the shadow of Mount Iceblade, near the Gulf of Thunder. Deavron was mildly impressed with the intelligence of this man, but found his lack of subtlety in the application of physical might and total disregard of magical knowledge to be insufferable. Of course, this is why he was supposed to help him. With Deavron's assistance, Wolfbane had won the war with the Napoleon Empire, and gained a foothold for Naroth on the continent of Lagotia, the land that most interested him. Why Naroth cared so much about this place, Deavron did not know, and he prided himself on knowing everything. It was no secret he was highest in the god of death's ranks, and by his own doing, he was also the most feared. Deavron reveled in the cowering forums of the lesser members of Naroth's following, as it provided a way for him to keep them from disturbing his great work. But for all his power, death, while it had not claimed Deavron, did infuse him with a few less desirable traits. Worn and dry-rotten as a corpse, his body was held together only by the magic that had resurrected him. Over time, he lost much of his physical shape, reduced to a graying, flaky skin around hardened, shrunken muscle and old, creaking bone. His magical reanimation imbued him with unnatural strength and allowed for many other benefits, like shedding the necessity of sleep, but being conscious of his appearance. Deavron avoided allowing his face or body to be seen by wearing a cloak, robe, and silken wrap about his decaying jaw when in the presence of others. That was more for their benefit than his. Fear was a powerful tool, but it could be a hindrance on some occasions, and his role required that once in a while he had to converse with this rabble that scurried about the fringes of his domain. So now he carried out his immortal lord's personal agenda from his labyrinth in the dungeons of the newly christened Castle Bane, formerly Nepal City Castle. Here he continued, at an even more exasperatingly slow rate, his experiments that had begun in the isolated hovel to the north. He was also tasked with finding two men Naroth was deeply concerned about. These two apparently posed an actual threat to the god of death's many plans, though Deavron did not understand the precise danger to his schemes. All he knew was in them lay the potential to prevent Naroth from achieving his goal of utter conquest of the mortal realm of Teth Tanir. Deavron had been informed there was reason to believe other deities were trying to assist the two mortals he sought, so it fell to the mighty Undying Wizard to locate them and be sure they were dealt with. Deavron had made some progress in ascertaining the whereabouts of one of the two mortals, but none of his methods had located the second. The first was currently in Gylakil, and where the other was could be anyone's guess. The mage was pleased with his progress, knowing his patron had not expected such results so fast. He was troubled that the second individual he had not learned anything about, but considered it a mere matter of time. Instead, Deavron focused on what he had accomplished, for by his calculation, the first of his targets would be dead in Gylakil before the night was through. Finally, what Deavron had dreaded most occurred. A bell rang softly down the corridor in his chambers. He was being summoned to a meeting with the Fortress Council, led by Wolfbane. Respect for Wolfbane he had, but his subordinates were fools, in Deavron's opinion. They lacked the occasional cunning and guile that their leader possessed, with the exception of one. He looked, to untrained eyes, to be a young man of some elven lineage, but his quick wit and oddly colored, sharp eyes held an older kind of wisdom and had enabled him to learn more than he was supposed to. Deavron sighed with a hiss like steam out of a loose valve. He had to convince Wolfbane that the lost elf known as Edgewolf Elvak was too dangerous to keep around. At that moment, that same Edge Elvak was unaware of Deavron's dire plans for him. The young commander had ridden hard from the edges of the great northern waste to reach Nepal City that evening, and was now trotting his fine warhorse through the gloomy streets of the metropolis. Nepal City was a dark industrial maze with four great hills and narrow, steep streets of irregular pavement or cobblestone. The buildings in Nepal City loom over those thin alleyways like dark judges, observing unblinkingly even the most furtive of passersby as they wind their way through among the high walls of windows and stone about them. The main roads are slightly less imposing, and efforts were made in the past to build parks of a kind, to offer more open views of the sky, but even these attempts cannot quell the constant noise of loud voices, baying animals, and banging items that never fully ceases even in the dark of night. It has never been a city welcoming, even to its own people, but it has been home to many. Yet when Edge came to Nepal City, he came not as a traveler, but as part of her conquest. Under the tyranny of Wolfbane, Nepal City had been culled in a day. The end of the empire was mercifully quick, but the suffering of her former citizens had lasted for months now, with no sign of relief forthcoming. Edge tried to keep his brilliant, entirely green eyes in front of him, avoiding the lost and dead looks of the populace as he passed their battered and worn homes. He had not wanted this. Following his master, his hero, Wolfbane, from the west, he had expected to find a mission of noble intent. Instead, he had become part of a great shroud over the corpse of a once proud nation. Down the main road he steered his mount. Before him he could see the gates to Nepal City Castle, now cruelly renamed Castle Bane. Spikes stood out all about the entrance like sadistic fangs, each holding the head of an enemy of the Narothian army, or those who had dared to join the Nepalian resistance once their nation fell. Edge had brought some of these men to their fate here, and each time he rode past, the weight of his involvement in the tragedy of the Nepalian Empire's ignominious end was suffocating. Nearing the heavy doors to the castle, he heard the great chains commanding them pull back as they opened, and he slowed his gait as he passed them by, coming to a stop within. Handing the reins to one of the soldiers that came to assist him, he inquired after Wolfbane's whereabouts. Upstairs, Lord Edgewolf, one of the men informed him. He's called a meeting in the war room. Without a word, Edge marched to the central castle, and the guards unquestioningly let him in. The main hall of Castle Bane was now used only for ceremonies of surrender. Before the invaders arrived, it contained wall paintings and grand tapestries depicting the building of the Nepalian nation out of a region mostly consisting of dead, frozen tundra, led by thanes of the oldest families in the north, many of whom had been scourged from their homeland. Wolfbane had torn down the tapestries and covered the walls in the weapons of his defeated foes. The former fortress of Nepal now held the broken shields of its own housecarls. In place of the fine woven rugs, Wolfbane had furs and skins of exotic animals leading up to a monstrous throne built of iron with thin streaks of silver woven in like crashing lightning behind a heavy seat. Decked out in its barbaric finery, it was the most intimidating place to be in the fortress, until one went to the war room. Edge lingered momentarily in the main hall, his eyes scanning over the shattered shields and tattered banners. He did not sense d'Airvaron, standing plainly in the entryway from the stairs of his dungeon chambers that led to the upper floors, watching him silently. Edge closed his eyes and thought of the past, the time when he believed they were coming to save the people of Legotia and all Teth Tanir. The optimism of that time seemed defeated completely by these symbols of conquest and destruction. Sighing, he walked past the throne into the servants' stairwell at the back, beginning the arduous climb to the war room. Up a long flight of over 600 stairs was the strategic heart of Castle Bane. Located in the highest point of the castle, it was accessible only through a well-concealed entrance near the servants' corridors that looked, even upon careful examination, like a blank wall. Having watched Edgelvok scan the hall, d'Airvaron gave him time to begin his ascent before following. He strode determinedly across the throne room and to the same secret stairwell Edge had passed into before him. Through the narrow entryway d'Airvaron swept, having made his way quickly but unhurriedly. He was always emphatic he should never appear rushed by anyone, for he answered to no mortal, and especially no one in this fortress. d'Airvaron made his way up the sinuous spiral staircase with ease. The eeriness of its climb did not escape him. No decorations adorned the walls, and it gave the illusion that one had been climbing into space for days. In reality, it was only about 10 minutes before the mage reached the heights of the tower. He knew beyond the room he was about to enter lay Wolfbane's private chambers containing a forge, map room, and makeshift bed, although the general slept little. Upon entering the main chamber, bedecked with furniture and other concessions to the public nature of its purpose, he was pleased to see he was the last of the 6 commanders to arrive. Sweeping an icy stare around the room, he appeared to flow over to his black iron seat and settle into a small cushion. Comfort had never been a big concern, not as big a concern as intimidation to the ancient wizard. d'Airvaron sat opposite the general himself. No man except for Edge, who had traveled with him prior to the general's arrival in Legotia, knew Wolfbane's true origins, though the rumors were many. Wolfbane was in his late 40s, or perhaps older, a human with an incredible muscular build who wielded a massive twin-bladed battle axe in combat. His aggressive combat style and willingness to wade into the fray on his own front lines told d'Airvaron that somewhere in his past he had been accustomed to fighting his battles himself. The mage found it hard to believe any man could overcome Wolfbane in single combat. But of course his magic would render the commander helpless if it were deemed necessary. 2 cross straps adorned with strange bits of spiked metal over a massive bare chest held Wolfbane's smaller throwing axes. He was renowned for his deadly aim with them, and had killed more than a few men from great distances before they even got close enough to see him. He had on heavy leather pants with metal studs and thick-soled war boots made for long marches. Wolfbane was quite plainly not a native Napoleon or even Lagosian. He had shaggy black hair, streaked with gray at the temples, together with a full beard and hanging mustache covering his tanned and weathered face. His eyes were narrower than those of a Lagosian, and along with his darker complexion, this marked him as a Taman man from the desert known as the Pirate Sands in the west. Unusually for those people, Wolfbane's eyes were an icy gray in color, and stood out starkly from his tanned and earthen tones of hair and skin. Regardless of his origins, those who sat around him feared him almost as much as they did d'Airvaron, though not in the same way. The two sat across from one another to display the assumed equality between them in the current state of conquest. A simple nod was exchanged, and d'Airvaron looked around at the other 4 men and 1 woman stationed about the table. All of them had played a part in the downfall of the Napoleon Empire, some directly and others less so. Among them, the wizard found little worth noting. They were small pieces in a much larger game, one they could not ever hope to understand. As such, he found these meetings tedious and frustrating. To Wolfbane's right sat Hrothgar Conan, publicly holder of the title of High Thane of Nepal. Hrothgar had risen to power through his small army of archers, the criminal empire of Nepal City's dark underworld, and a secret cabal of assassins. He was a wiry little man hidden in his shifting black cloak. Beneath the frail-looking features was a body hardened and toughened by many knives in the back and minor doses of poison to make him resistant to the deadly efforts of his myriad enemies. House Conan was one of the founding houses of Nepal City, but Hrothgar himself was better known in Nepal prior to joining Wolfbane's ranks for his networks of spies and cutthroats, as well as the many illegal operations he ran within the city. Together, he and d'Airvaron had worked the secret political war behind the physical violence of Wolfbane's conquest. As newly named High Thane, his power should have increased immensely, but everyone knew the title was meaningless despite Hrothgar's attempts to assert authority. His strength still came from his old trades in prostitution, gambling, and various mind-altering herbs and chemicals sold on the street. Hrothgar had close to 100 followers skilled in the craft of intimidation and assassination, along with nearly 1,000 archers who had once manned the walls of Nepal City for the former High Thane. By Hrothgar's own orders, several of his spies and murderers answered only to d'Airvaron, in an attempt to curry favor with the powerful mage. The man knew how to cast his lot with whoever was likely to come out on top, and his desire to obtain wealth and power had made betraying his own country an easy decision. For his part, d'Airvaron considered Hrothgar an irrelevant rodent. The man on the High Thane's right was even lower in than Hrothgar in Deirvron's eyes. He was a mage from the city of Osmandius, trained in the wizard's fortress, but originally from Nepal. He had come to the side of Wolfbane on orders given to him by his god Narath. His power was puny compared to Deirvron's own, but Saltillion was strong for his time. The younger mage was always nervous, eyes shifting back and forth and running his fingers up and down his staff's runes. He stammered often, too, a defect many suspected had been beaten into him during his time under the care of parents who had never wanted another child, let alone one so disinterested in the martial tradition of the Napoleon Empire. He was unnecessary to the cause, as far as Deirvron was concerned. Valissa Ulfrin was the only female at the table. A very attractive woman, she had pale blonde hair and weather-tanned skin over a lithe but muscular body. Though many foolish enough to doubt a woman's battle prowess would not have thought it, she was the best sword fighter in all the northern lands. She had fought along against Wolfbane and the Narathian army during the invasion, her skill convincing him to offer her a place in his ranks rather than having her killed. Her family had fallen during the first phase of the invasion, when the town of Tianus and the seat of House Ulfrin was taken by the Narathians, with no aid coming from the other Napoleon thanes. On the surface, Valissa would have been considered a simple study. Frequently she dressed in clothing that could be politely described as scandalous, using her beauty and cleverness to manipulate men into doing what she wanted. In truth, she despised most men completely, because the male-centric culture of Nepal had restricted her rise to a position of command and respect within the military, despite her obvious qualifications. The only man she was said to tolerate, and perhaps even hold affection for, was Wolfbane. His personal interest in her as a warrior, not a pet or subservient lover, had been all it took to convince her that she belonged to the Narathian forces, even if her faith in the god of death was non-existent. Deirvron watched as Valissa turned and whispered something to the youngest council member sitting to her left, bringing the mage's gaze quickly around to him. His unearthly eyes narrowed, and he focused harder on the individual than he had on any other. Edge replied with something that made the woman nod, and met Deirvron's gaze unfalteringly. Edgewolf Elvak appeared, and was treated, as the youngest seated in the room. But he had a sense of honor and respect for fairness that had no place in Deirvron's schemes, or those of his master Narath. Edge had startlingly white hair over smooth and Deirvron supposed handsome face. Built thin but strong, he was extremely agile and very good with a halberd. The most astonishing thing about him were his eyes, which were entirely green and glowed slightly. Deirvron doubted very much that even Edge knew this marked him as a native of Haddon Merk and a lost elf. Deirvron knew much of the Haddon Merk people. They were isolationists, utterly disinterested in the world outside their islands. And yet, many years ago, several prominent families had sent missionaries to other locales around Tethtanir to bring the knowledge of the lost elves to them. One such family had been Elvak, and it was likely one of these pilgrims to whom Edge could trace his lineage. Deirvron admired the traditionalism and unbending law of the lost elves, and found the few who still existed outside Haddon Merk to be poor imitations of that greater culture. Several had tried to bring change to the world, and as near as Deirvron could tell, they had all failed. Deirvron continued to study the outsider. For all his youthful appearance, Edge was almost as old as Wolfbane, his race being one of the first mortals, and many living 200 years or more. Edge wore a silvery chainmail over his dark blue tunic adorned with a strange design to his cloak clasps, a pair of skeletal hands that held a connective chain between them. Where these had come from, Deirvron had always wanted to know, but he let his examination halt for now. Instead, he turned his attention to a quiet conversation between Wolfbane and the last member of the council, Caermon Arifos. The conquest of the Napoleon Empire had required the enlistment of elements within it that would make overthrowing the government and nation easier and less bloody. Caermon Arifos had, in some ways, been a valuable asset in that process, but he was also a man deeply wedded to his house's history and longing for revenge on those he believed had wronged his family. The Arifos people had a long-standing feud with the Napoleon Empire, and particularly the Squalls, who had held the role of advisors to the High Thane before Wolfbane's successful invasion. The brutal execution and imprisonment of the Squall family, after their patriarch and Thane, Greymane Squall, opened the gates of Nepal City to the invaders in exchange for a quiet, shameless exit he never received, had been strongly advocated by Caermon. Wolfbane had justified the deaths of the Squalls, and Greymane in particular, as a necessary action, eliminating a potential threat to his absolute dominion over the north. Moreover, Greymane had not negotiated for the lives of his people or sanctity of his nation, but the preservation of his own reputation. This was because Hrothgar had caught him in a web of lies of omission. Before the invasion had ever even commenced, the Thane of House Conan had acquired promises from Greymane to overlook his illegal operations in Nepal City, which by all rights Greymane should have shut down upon discovering. When the invaders reached the city, Hrothgar had then blackmailed Greymane into opening the gates, promising his family's honor would not be destroyed in the process. It was one of the greatest lies Hrothgar had ever told. Greymane could not have known Caermon Arifos was among the invaders, or he might have realized Hrothgar's deceit and stood fast in defending the city. Deirvron believed the former Thane of House Squall to have been a fool for trusting Hrothgar at all, for he was clearly little more than a gifted liar and criminal. Regardless, Greymane had bent under the threat of exposure and been broken. His family died in the main hall of Nepal City Castle or amid the dungeons, and though he had managed to escape before his own execution, he was undoubtedly a shell of a man. It was Caermon Arafos who had relished the obliteration of House Squall the most, for his family had been driven from the town of Glaciar and across the great northern waste in the founding days of the north by the Squalls, and had sought revenge for generations since. Wolfbane had stood by Caermon's zealous insistence at killing or imprisoning most of the Squall family. As for Greymane, Wolfbane claimed he could not keep a traitor who would offer up his whole nation in exchange for his name and legacy. D'Evrons had seen the flaw in that logic. After all, Hrothgar Conan had remained an integral part of their council and had committed many acts of betrayal against his own people. But the lives of the Squalls meant nothing to him, and he saw no benefit to intervening on their behalf, except for one. D'Evrons had detected an unusual spark of magical energy in one of Greymane's daughters and had her spared, as she might prove useful to him later. It was a small benefit to the bloody business that had become most trying to the dread wizard due to the unfortunate escape of Greymane Squall. His flight had caused an unnecessary interruption in D'Evrons' studies, as Narath seemed determined he be recaptured, or better yet, killed. For his part, once D'Evrons found Greymane, he intended to make the former Thane pay dearly for inconveniencing him. D'Evrons returned his attention to the moment at hand. The meeting was beginning. Wolfbane stood and removed the round sigil from his belt and placed it on the table. It depicted a black wolf's head with white eyes and fangs on a red field, the symbol of the Bloodwolf mercenaries, Wolfbane's first conquest in his road to this new Narathian kingdom he was forging. In a deep rumbling voice, he pronounced, "As a servant to the god of death, Narath, I hereby call this meeting to order. May the Shepherd of Souls spare us until our work is done." Slowly the others followed suit with their own symbols of office, and the meeting came to order. All right, so that is Chapter 3, and I haven't seen anybody pop into the chat, so I'm going to assume there's not going to be any Q&A today, which is totally fine. Chapter 4 will pick up on Wednesday at 6, per usual. One sec. I will say that there's a lot of historical dump that happens in that chapter. It gets revisited later on. Also, for those who are concerned about keeping track of all the characters and the places and the names, the second edition of the sword and the first edition of the shield, which are the two that are available right now, do contain glossaries specific to the book. And those glossaries have in them specifically nations. So this here lists all the families of Anglo-Deus, excuse me, the Nepalian Empire, are the two that are mentioned in this book. And then there's an additional glossary of all the characters, so significant people who show up. For example, Greymane Squall, who we just were told betrayed his people in that chapter, appears as a note right there. Other major characters like Caermon, D'Evrons, Wolfbane, they all show up in there in that part. And lastly, there is a section that just lists all of the gods and their domains. So for example, it gives you the first gods, and then it gives you, on the far side here, the longer list, a series of minor gods. So if you find that kind of stuff overwhelming, it's really hard to sort of like wrap your head around where I'm going, what I'm doing, what all these characters, who are these people, am I supposed to remember that name, who is that person? It's in the back of the book, and I swear to you that I put every character that appears, if a name is mentioned in the book, it appears in the glossary. The footnote for that character might be really short, or it could be a paragraph. And the only thing to be sort of, what I would say to a reader is, if you're going to read the book, maybe wait till you're like a third of the way through before you start going and digging in the glossary, because while I tried really hard to avoid spoilers in the descriptions, it's possible you read about a character that you don't know something about yet, and it is mentioned in passing in the definition. So that's it for today. Fairly short reading section. I'll be back on Wednesday at 6 o'clock, and I'll be around tomorrow sometime in the evening for the Dragonspear live reading. Thanks for putting up with me being really hot. It's warm here. And hopefully if you caught this now or on YouTube later, you enjoyed it. Thanks.